They were lifting their glasses to celebrate her promotion, $85 steaks gleaming under restaurant lights, while I sat at home stirring a bowl of instant soup that tasted like silence. Then my phone buzzed, a text. Heat up the leftovers in the fridge, don't waste them. Moments later, I saw their smiling Instagram photo, all of them together except me. And something inside me snapped into perfect clarity. 3 hours later, I walked out of that house with the key in my pocket and every piece of evidence I'd quietly gathered for months. By sunrise, they were staring at a legal summons on the kitchen table, a voicemail they couldn't talk their way out of, and a co-ownership agreement they never imagined they'd be forced to sign. I didn't crumble. I didn't beg. I rebuilt every boundary they had shattered and rewrote the rules they thought I would follow forever. If you've ever felt sidelined by the very people you've given everything to, hit like, subscribe, and share your story in the comments. This is for anyone who's been treated like background noise. And finally, decided to speak louder. My name is Clara Mendoza. For 42 years, the house at the end of our street was stitched to me the way a favorite shawl clings to shoulders in winter, worn at the edges, stitched with decades of ordinary sacrifices, the faint perfume of my husband Luis's shirts still smelling faintly of his aftershave even years after he'd gone. That smell is the first thing I reach for when I close my eyes. Lemon oil from the kitchen table, the click of a knitting needle on the porch as dusk pulls its blanket over the neighborhood, the creak of the back gate when the kids from 2 houses down sprint for the park. Those are the small, steady things that made up my life and kept me breathing. Luis would sit at the breakfast table and read the paper while I threaded the needle or mended a sock. He'd hum tunelessly while stirring his coffee, and I would tuck my hands into the pocket of my cardigan and watch him. After he died, the house stayed. The house was the only place that felt like him. I kept his shirts in a drawer for months, fished them out when the nights were unusually cold, and breathed in what was left of him. Mateo, my son, grew up in that house. I remember him as a little boy with scraped knees and a laugh that filled rooms the way sunlight does. He used to help me in the garden, pulling weeds with the earnestness of someone who believed it mattered. As he got older, he learned to close doors softly, learned to argue quietly so as not to wake his father. He became a careful man, the kind you trust with your keys. When he met Valeria, I thought she was bright and funny. She had a laugh like a bell and a way of moving through a room that made people turn, but people change. Or perhaps the truth is simpler. Some people were always brittle, and life only gave them more ways to sharpen. The first time I felt my name being pushed from my throat, it was subtle. Mateo would call me Mum when he wanted dinner. When Valeria was annoyed, she'd shout across the kitchen, "Mother-in-law, can you pass me the salt?" Always that formal, distant label, as if I were an occupant of a contract rather than the person who had wiped up the milk when they were babies. Names are small things, but they anchor you. No one calls you by your name, and you begin to feel like furniture. There were little cruelty, sown like seeds. I would arrive at family gatherings and stand in the doorway while photographs were taken, the camera fixed on a smiling line that always, somehow, had room for Valeria's mother and not for me. "Stand with us, Mom," Mateo would say, and my feet would shuffle forward, hopeful only to be told there wasn't space. "You'll be in the next one," someone would say with a sympathetic smile that tasted like pity and vinegar. I learned to lower my expectations the way you lower blinds in the sun, slowly, automatically, dimming the light on myself. Valeria had a way of making chores into its own performance of dominance. She'd inspect a clean surface and tap the corner as if it were a test I had failed. "You didn't dust behind the vase," she'd say, as if a single overlooked speck invalidated a life of doing. Once, at a barbecue, she leaned in and told a friend loud enough for me to hear, "She's useful, though. She always cooks." The word useful stuck worse than any insult. It was not merely that she reduced me to tasks. She rewrote the terms of our relationship so that my name, my history became irrelevant. I was useful. I was replaceable. We sold the house I'd lived in with Luis because the bills had crept up and the mortgage felt like a shadow at my heels. I had savings, pension money tucked away from years of scrimping, and when Mateo asked with that careful expression that used to mean tenderness, I offered what I could. The closing was a small ceremony of pens and paper. I remember the sound of a fountain pen as if it were a bell. The sun angled through the real estate office window and landed on the contract like judgment. I signed my name with hands that trembled not from age but from a cocktail of hope and fear. $68,000 for a down payment, Mateo said, his voice steady as if anchoring both of us to a better future. We'll all be together, he promised. I saw visions of a home where grandchildren raced in the yard and Sunday dinners were loud and warm. I saw my curtains, my chair by the window, my life continuing as it had, but shared. After the papers were signed, I felt proud and a little dizzy. I had given away the last house that was mine because love, I thought, required sacrifice. I thought of Luis sitting on the porch and smiling at me with that little lopsided grin. But promises can be fragile, air thin. And in the years that followed, that $68,000 became invisible money that had been meant to buy a place at a family table, not to be spent like spare change. At first, the changes were almost tender. Mateo would run a hand over my hair, ask if I needed anything. But the little thoughtfulness frayed. Dinners began to be occasions where I served and withdrew, like a tide. I cooked for birthdays, for holidays. I cleaned the same counters until my knuckles thickened from dish soap. Diego and Sofia, my grandchildren, treated me with the gentle affection of children, until Valeria taught them to pose for photos another way, pulling them in close and angling their faces toward the camera, as if to say, "Look at us." My presence in pictures shrank until one day I noticed I'd been cropped from a portrait and my name had been cropped from a life. There were darker things, too. Once, Valeria stormed into the kitchen and flung open the oven. "You left the pie," she snapped. "You nearly burned it." Her eyes danced with a small triumph, like a cat batting a toy. Mateo stood there, shoulders slack, watching us jockey for terrain. I retreated to the laundry room and sat on the closed washing machine to cast the heat from my face. My hands smelled of lemon oil and flour, and I felt the ridiculous, sharp sting of humiliation, singled out for something so petty. I began to keep small notebooks, not because I wanted to prove anything dramatic, but because memory is slippery and evidence is stubborn. I wrote the dates I helped with the mortgage, the nights I sat up with feverish children, the times I lent money and the amounts. I wrote the little things I noticed, how Valeria would roll her eyes if I reached for the camera, how Mateo would laugh too loudly when his wife told a joke at my expense. These notes were private at first, the sort of thing you whisper into the dark at 3 a.m., but over time, they became a ledger of a life given and overlooked. The image that sits in my head like a splinter is simple. An Instagram post glowing on a screen, a table of shining plates and trembling candles, Valeria in a dress that caught the light and held it like she'd trapped the sun. I should have been invited. I should have been there with them because this was my family, my blood. Instead, I was at home with a cup of instant soup, the kind you heat up and stir with a plastic spoon. I can still taste that soup, the thinness of it, the way it cooled before I could swallow. I scrolled through the photos they posted, each one a small verdict. "So proud of Valeria," read the caption. There were smiling faces, Mateo's arm around his wife, Diego and Sofia in matching jackets. And not one of those bright, laughing faces included me. I remember the exact words of the text that arrived like a pebble that starts a ripple. "Mother-in-law, remember to heat up the leftovers in the fridge. Don't waste them." There was a tiny smiley face at the end, as if to sweeten the insult. It sat there, ordinary and sharp, a punctuation that folded up 3 years of small cruelties into a single paper-thin slash. I read it in the kitchen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears like surf. They had spent an evening at an expensive restaurant, something about a promotion, a celebration where people drank wine that cost more than my pension per glass. And I had not been invited. They had posed without me, laughed without me, and then, by way of courtesy, sent me a household task. "Don't waste them," she wrote, as though I were an appliance whose only purpose was to keep the scraps of their happiness from going to waste. The house, my house, had been a theater for small humiliations, each one performed with the kind of casual cruelty that makes people believe they are only joking. I thought of the check I'd signed, the $70,000 that had been hope folded into paper. I thought about the knitting needles and the way the porch light catches dust at noon. I thought about the little notebooks with their tally of favors and loans and time given without a corresponding return. There are moments when a life shifts not with a single thunderclap, but with the quiet placement of a stone in a stream. That text was the stone. I remember looking at the timestamp on my phone, the tiny light of the screen illuminating my knuckles. Instantly, years of being on the edge of myself, the erasures, the polite commands, the omission from photographs, arranged themselves into a pattern that I could no longer ignore. The pattern told a simple story. I had been taken for granted, my generosity had been treated as an open account rather than an offering of love. I folded the phone back into my palm. The soup on the table steamed in a faint, embarrassed plume. The knitting needles sat like two small oars on my lap. For a breath, one long, slow inhale. I let myself be weary. There is an exhaustion that settles in your bones when you have been accommodating for a long time. A fatigue that feels almost moral, as if the world has asked more of you than it had any right to. My hand hovered over the reply field. The letters formed themselves under my thumb like small soldiers. Okay. 2 letters that could mean surrender or calm. 2 letters that could be a time bomb. I pictured Mateo's face when he saw how small his mother had become. I pictured Valeria's face when she realized that a woman she had called the maid had a name, a history, and, quiet as it had been, leverage. I put the phone down. I folded my scarf over my lap. The porch light turned the room into a small pool of amber. Somewhere in the house, a clock clicked. I had always been a patient woman, but patience is not an endless currency. Money can be returned, apologies can be manufactured, but what I wanted most was to stand up straight and be seen. For the first time in a long while, I felt that the thing I wanted was not vengeance so much as visibility and justice arranged so sturdily that it could not be denied. The thumb still trembled when I finally pressed OK. But it was a different kind of trembling now. Less like a surrender and more like the tightening of a rope before a knot is tied. I reached for the notebook I'd hidden in the drawer, the one with dates and amounts and small, careful notes. My hand closed around it with a resolve that surprised me. There would be consequences. There would be words and lawyers and the rattling of things long left unexamined. For now, though, I folded my scarf, stood up, and picked up my keys. I walked out the front door, not as someone fleeing, but as someone stepping into a plan she had been assembling quietly for years. The night air tasted like the lemon oil I used on the table and the distant echo of a life I was not yet ready to surrender. I locked the door behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I walked without imagining that I was invisible. They posted the pictures before I even finished swallowing the last spoonful of soup, a glossy grid of laughter. Mateo with his arm around Valeria, her new promotion pin catching the light, Diego and Sofia grinning with sticky mouths, Valeria's mother leaning in like she owned the night. The stakes looked like small monuments. The caption glittered with champagne emojis. My thumbnail of instant soup looked like a secret in a cracked teacup. I remember the sound of the metal spoon against the paper bowl. It had a hollow, echoing voice that matched the room. The soup was lukewarm. The steam rose in a sad, thin ribbon that smelled faintly of powdered chicken and plastic. My stomach made a sound that felt like a confession. I clicked the video they'd uploaded. Slow pans, a toast, the clink of crystal. I played it once, then again. My chair creaked in my kitchen. Their laughter filled the screen and my small room at the same time. They were glowing. I was transparent. It's a strange thing to catalog humiliation as if it were evidence, but that's what I had become, an archivist of the slow rot. Short sentences sometimes say more. They were happy. I was hungry. They shared photos. I was absent from the frame. The word they used for me fit like someone slapping a label across my chest. Mother-in-law. Not my name, not Clara, a title like a task. The ledger sat on my kitchen table beneath the closed laptop. It had a brown paper cover, pages edged with years. I turned to pages I'd written in small, careful numbers, deposits, transfers, the way pennies had added up to mortgages. I had written down every dollar because the memory of my husband's hand, the way he'd press his thumb into the paper when we signed anything, was still fresh enough that I could not trust memory alone. $68,000, the down payment I handed over at the closing table. My hands trembled on the pen that day, the same fingers that knit evenings into scarves, the same fingers that curled around Luis's shirts when I folded them. I remember the smell of the leather contract, the varnish on the desk, the soft murmur of the agent. I remember thinking then that I was doing this for family. I remember trusting Mateo to make it right. The ledger had more than the down payment. It showed the months where my pension slid into the mortgage account, where I covered utilities, where I stepped in to pay the plumber when they said they'd get to it next month. When I added it all up, when the ink dried and the totals lined up like solemn witnesses, the number stared back at me. $136,800. A life of small sacrifices, a lifetime of habit, now tallied like receipts after a funeral. I held the deed in my hands that afternoon and felt an odd burning clarity. The paper is thin, but the words are heavy. 847 Jurist Circuit. My name alone across the top, typed in crisp, indifferent font. For months I had assumed the house was theirs as much as it had been mine. But the signatures told a different story. Somewhere between the estate lawyer and the moving truck, nobody had moved the name. It was a technicality. It was a lifeline. Short sentences again. It was mine. It was still mine. I turned the page as if the paper might change its mind and sign itself over. The ink did not rearrange. I did not brandish the deed like a weapon. I looked at it the way you look at an old photograph, with the ache that comes from remembering both what you lost and what you saved. It sat beside the ledger. Together they were a quiet argument. One contained my generosity. The other contained the legal fact that could no longer be ignored. There is a particular cruelty to being unseen in a house you own. You move through rooms that bear your laughter, your stitches, your husband's scent on a shirt hanging in the wardrobe. Yet the others treat your presence as if it were an afterthought, a shoulder they can lean on and then forget about when the food arrives. Valeria's messages were small knives disguised as assignments. Heat up the leftovers in the fridge, don't waste them. Delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who assumes the world is exactly as she needs it to be. I did not record everything at first. You don't plan to gather proof when you're weary from grief. The recordings began almost by accident. A phone call when I was trying to arrange a doctor's appointment, a voice rising in the background as Valeria spoke to someone else. She was irritated that the laundry wasn't folded the way she preferred. She called it sloppiness. The next call was worse. A clipped, laughing comment on how free help made life simpler. The first time I played one back, I felt a small, physical pain, like a bruise found under the skin. I decided to document things because I needed a sort of map out of the fog. Not to punish, not for spectacle, for clarity, for legal breathing room. I sought advice from Camilla before I did anything else. Camilla, sharp, fierce lawyer niece with a no-nonsense bun and a habit of folding her hands to the rhythm of other people's lies. I told her everything. She listened and then told me what I needed to know about what evidence might be admissible, about the forms that would be the difference between a paper trail and a paperweight. I asked questions about legality and she answered without romanticizing the law. She told me the boundaries and I stayed well within them. I recorded the calls because I needed to hear the truth when my memory wanted to blur it. I recorded because sometimes the sound of a person saying your name like it's a rectangle, mother-in-law, is different from the woman who used to dance in the kitchen with Luis. I did not record how to make the recordings. I recorded to preserve a voice so that when it came time to speak aloud, I would have the exact sound of the cruelty to hold up. I listened to an audio clip once in the small hours when the house was canted between two breaths. Valeria's voice bled through the tiny speaker. She did not know I was listening. "She's our free maid," she said, the words like a pocket knife. They were brief, but they landed like a verdict. I pressed my thumb into the rim of the wooden table until the grain marked my skin. No melodrama, just the cold fact of what she'd said. There is slow violence in little exclusions. The nights I sat on the couch and scrolled through their online albums, cropping myself out of the edges in my mind. The dinners I set when they were home, and the way their eyes slid past me to whatever promised immediate pleasure. The way Mateo would answer for me, smoothing rough edges because confrontation felt like a betrayal of our peace. I had loved peace, I had paid for peace, I had not paid to become invisible, so I began to prepare, not with malice but with a careful economy of motion. On a rainy Tuesday, I copied files to a small, unremarkable USB stick and sealed it in a plain envelope. The envelope felt heavier than its size justified. Inside, copies of the deed, scans of bank statements, audio files, snapshots of messages, my ledger annotated with dates and notes. I labeled nothing in bold. I did not boast. I did not prepare for a spectacle. I prepared for a meeting. Packing was a quiet ritual. I folded 3 shirts, a cardigan with a moth or 2 in the hem, my knitting needles, a pair of comfortable shoes. I did not take the crystal. I left behind things that had more sentimental weight than legal. I put the deed in my purse. I tucked the ledger in between pages of a book I had never finished. I put the USB in a small sock and tied it like a secret. I met Camila in a coffee shop that smelled of espresso and rain. She arrived with a folder and eyes like winter. We spoke in low, quick sentences. She said things that sounded like maps. "We'll need a chain of custody for the recordings," she said, "and copies of bank statements with transaction IDs." I nodded. I felt 20 years younger and 40 years older at once. I told her what mattered, the truth, plainly exposed, and the remedy that would prevent further exploitation. She arranged for a notary review. She made calls. She did not promise fireworks. She promised process. She handed me a checklist printed on white paper. I folded it into my palm like a prayer and read it on the bus home. Deposit copies. Witness affidavit. Draft of a proposed agreement. She told me to breathe. There were practicalities I had not considered. Utility bills in both names. Tax forms, the kind of bureaucratic detritus that made revenge feel small and real. I paid what I could in cash to avoid any further confusion. I traced my steps through the last 3 years and left a breadcrumb of receipts. The ledger became more than numbers, it became a timeline. My internal voice churned in short, jagged sentences. This is wrong. This is mine. This is not what I thought love looked like. I kept a large, heavy coffee mug near me and would lift it to steady my hands when my chest felt like it might seize. In those moments, I wrote longer sentences, because longer sentences let you breathe, and I told myself how I had always been more than the roles others had assigned me. I reminded myself that dignity was not an abstract, it was something to be practiced like any craft. At night, I imagined them coming home, the jingling of keys, the faint perfume of Valeria's evening. I imagined them opening the door to find the house changed in a way only walls and contracts could show. I did not take joy in their panic. I wanted them to wake up to a truth big enough that denial would not hold. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a promise. There is a terrible neatness to my final preparations. I wrote a note for Mateo, not as a threat, but as a ledger of choices. You will find documents on your nightstand. Read them carefully. We will see each other soon with lawyers present. I chose words that would not be inflammatory, but would be exact. I slid the envelope, not the big binder, just a thin packet, onto his nightstand because it would make him stop. The nightstand where his phone usually slept. The nightstand he had learned to ignore. I left instructions for Anna, the neighbor who waters my plants when I go out of town. I called Elena, my friend, and told her where I'd be for the night. I wanted human proof that I had not vanished into some melodrama. I wanted witnesses who knew me as more than a role. I wanted to sleep without the thread of anticipation taut in my throat. I walked the house one last time and noticed the small things I had stopped seeing. The scuff on the baseboard by the downstairs hallway, the dent in the kitchen cupboard where Luis had once hit a pan in a mood I'd since forgiven. I closed drawers gently, as if tucking memories into neat corners. I picked up the key from the hook by the door. It was heavier than I remembered. My thumb grazed the metal, and I felt a final, odd clarity. There was an interval, a space where everything could still change. I could stay and make the case in whispers and small compromises. I could hold on to a peace that would never ask me to be a person, or I could close the door behind me and force the world to look. I slid the key into the lock, turned it. The mechanism made a sound that is as ordinary as morning, but as final as a judge's gavel. The house exhaled. I took one last breath, folded my hands around the deeds and the USB like someone carrying fragile things across a busy street, and walked away. The click echoed down the hallway, and I felt it travel through me, a small percussion marking the start of something inevitable. I walked out the front door with the key in my palm like it was a talisman. The porch light warmed my face for a second, and then I shut the door behind me, not slamming, just closing the chapter. Elena's house was 2 streets over, the place where I'd once learned how to make proper tea after Luis died. The place that still smelled faintly of his old wool jumper on the chair where I used to sit. It felt wrong and right at the same time to go there, as an adult who had finally chosen herself. I carried a small overnight bag and the little cardboard box with my ledger, the USB, and the photocopy of the deed. I tucked everything under my coat like contraband treasure. The bus ride was ordinary, the same pothole I avoided, the same bloke with the paper, the same summer air. Nothing dramatic. That ordinariness was its own scream. Life continuing as if nothing mattered when everything had just been rearranged. Elena made me a cup of tea that tasted like it had been steeped for the proper amount of time, not the instant, disappointing swirl I'd become used to. The steam rose and curled around my knuckles. I sat on a real bed that night. A mattress that didn't squeak, sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. I pressed my face into the pillow and felt, for the first time in a long while, the small, numb loosening that comes before sleep. I slept like a person who had forgotten how to, that ordinary comfort, the clink of a spoon against a proper bone china cup, the weight of a blanket, felt like a minor miracle. Meanwhile, in the house I'd paid for, their evening spun on. I saw it later in little frames and flashes, a photo of Valeria elegantly posed, a caption full of champagne emojis, a boomerang of Mateo laughing, a hand around Valeria's waist, Diego and Sofia making faces at the camera. The feed pulsed and glittered, a world apart from the tin of soup in my kitchen. They moved like people who had never once reckoned with the quiet erosion of someone else's life under their feet. When their car pulled up, voices were high with the residue of wine. I could almost hear them through the phone when Mateo called later, breathless with nerves I'd only recognize after the fact. The door opened beneath their laughter and perfume, the scent of an expensive night that clung to their clothes like a badge. They had the laughter of people who had been toasted by others and who had toasted themselves. They did not, in that moment, contemplate the documents that now lay waiting on a nightstand. I didn't run back. I didn't watch them come into their house with the camera of social media in their hands. Instead, I let it be. The civilized cruelty of my absence, the way a missing thing makes its presence known. It was a quiet exit. I had left a note for Mateo, folded with the neatness of someone who had to be precise for the justice to hold. You will find documents on your nightstand. Read them carefully. We will see each other soon with lawyers present. I left the key where he could find it because the truth needed no theatrics. The discovery was a sequence of sounds and images and a slow-motion collapse. Mateo's hand trembled when he unfolded the paper. He read the ledger, the pen strokes in my handwriting, the numbers that added up to everything I had given and then continued to give. He found the photocopy of the deed, and his fingers slipped on the glossy page like someone discovering an invisible trapdoor. Valeria's smile, the same smile that lined up for the camera, froze. The light on her phone reflected off her face, and in that reflection, I could see the first crack. I did not stay for their panic. I watched it later through a neighbor's trembling voicemail and a friend's text messages and through the trembling voice of my son, who called me while pacing the length of his living room. "Mom, what have you done?" he asked, and there was fear in it, a child's fear in a man's voice. I answered with calm I had practiced for weeks. Calm felt like armor. "What I should have done years ago," I said, and the line went quiet for a moment, then broke into pleading. Valeria called. I didn't pick up, but Camilla, my niece, the lawyer with the small, efficient smile, did. I could hear the pleading through Mateo's line. "Please, Camilla, this has to be fixed. She signed the papers. She can't do this. We didn't mean for any of this." Camilla's voice stayed steady. "We will act according to the law. The documents will speak for themselves." Later, Valeria begged to come home. Her voice, usually crisp and clipped, dissolved into thin, urgent threads. "Please, please," she said. "We can sort this out. We can—" The sentences broke like cheap pottery. The discovery unfolded like a film edit I had rehearsed in my head. A close-up on the ledger, the grocery receipts tucked inside, my scrawled note of mortgage contributions. Cut to Mateo's hand, to Valeria's face, to the phone's screen registering a missed call. Cut to a slow blur of them rifling through photo albums, trying to find a memory that would hold water against hard paper. They found the audio file I had left on the USB as well, a short, blunt recording of Valeria saying, "She's our free maid." It was not elaborate. It was a cold thing I had saved because words, once spoken, do not vanish. The panic that followed was not cinematic in the usual way. It was smaller, seedier, the kind that makes people rush and say the wrong things. Mateo called me again, voice raw. "Mom, we can fix this. We'll fix this," he told me, as if I had not already fixed the most important thing, my own dignity. Valeria called from the doorway of their kitchen, I was told later, every syllable polished to sound contrite. She begged, negotiated, promised. "We can take out a loan," she said at one point when she realized what she'd done. "I'll sign anything. I'll do anything." I had no interest in theatrical revenge, no taste for cruelty that simply added humiliation on top of humiliation. My plan had always been about correction. Camilla filed the notices with a clinical efficiency that made me proud and a little frightened all at once. She moved through the legal machinery like a woman turning the gears of a clock, the notice of intent, the statutory warning, the scheduled meeting with an independent mediator. The paperwork was not revenge in the melodramatic sense. It was the scaffolding by which the truth could be enforced. I watched the tremor in Mateo's voice when he told me Camilla had filed. It was the sound of a man realizing he had built his life on someone else's erasure. Their first phone calls after the filings were full of heat and paper-thin apology. Valeria left a string of voicemails where she tried on different tones. Contrition, anger, bargaining. "We're so sorry," one voice said. "We didn't realize we were selfish," another insisted. They begged to come home. They suggested meeting in neutral territory. They offered money, legal help, whatever to make me reconsider. "We can make this right," Mateo said in one message, voice cracked. There was a kind of humiliation in their desperation that felt like a mirror turned the other way. Where I had been erased, they now felt empty. I listened to their pleas, and I let them hang in the air like the scent of someone else's perfume. I considered, as one does when the stakes are both practical and intimate, what justice looked like. I thought of the nights I had washed their clothes, made their lunches, quietly fixed things no one thanked me for. I thought of every mother-in-law called across a room as if the name itself could diminish a person. I felt the grass of my own life beneath my feet for the first time in years. Word reached me in snippets, through a friend who had seen Valeria pacing in front of a solicitor's office, through a neighbor who whispered that Mateo had been seen in the backyard drinking from a bottle he'd never touched before. That panic had fully bloomed. The house, that had been a home, was now an arena of urgent conversations and clenching hands. They were learning the shape of their own choices through the cold geometry of court dates and affidavits. And yet, Even in the swirl of other people's fury and pleading, I felt an odd tenderness. I had not planned to humiliate them beyond exposure. My aim had been justice and repair. I wanted them to see me as a person, not a utility. I wanted the children to grow up watching their parents take responsibility, to see that respect is paid back by behavior, not lip service. I wanted, in the quietest place, for Mateo to stop being a man who preferred the ease of ignoring the truth. The paperwork was a harsh teacher, but sometimes the harshest lessons are the ones that prompt real change. When Camila told me she had served the legal notices, I remember the exact way the air felt in the room. Steady, like the slow inhale before a plunge. The clicking of the keys on her laptop had a gravity I'd come to trust. The world outside went on with its trivialities. A neighbor's lawnmower, a dog barking. While within our orbit, everything rearranged. They called, they cried, they offered, they begged, they offered to buy me out. They offered to sign anything. They offered apologies pre-measured for their convenience. I did not sign any quick settlement. I allowed negotiation to proceed along the lines I had set. Restitution measured, co-ownership and care stipulated, therapy required. I wanted a change that would be sustained. I wanted them to learn the discomfort of being accountable. They wanted to erase the evidence. I wanted them to face it. As the first urgent calls came to me, I sat on Elena's couch and breathed in the quiet. I felt the small, steady rhythm of my own heart, not as a frantic thing, but as the metronome of a life reclaimed. The camera, the metaphorical camera, the one this story will show you, lingers on that breath. It lingers on the fact that I had done the hard, boring work of preparing for this, and now the world had to catch up. Their panic was loud, but it was not mine to carry. I had been invisible for too long. I had spent years loosening the ropes of other people's expectations around my shoulders. Now that the ropes were cut, I was allowed to sit in the quiet and listen to the echo. I let the phones ring. I let their voices break and rebuild into whatever shape they'd become. I let the air carry the sound of them coming to terms with the fact that the house they'd taken for granted belonged to me by law, and by the measure of every dollar I had lent and every night I had worked. The last thing that happened before I let the day fold was a message from Mateo. A short text, no flourish, an attempt at steadiness. "We need to talk," it read. I replied with 2 words I had practiced like a meditation. "When you're ready." Then I set the phone aside and watched the steam from Elena's teapot curl into the air. My breathing stayed even. The camera lingers close on my face, calm, not triumphant, only resolved. I could have crushed them. That thought hovered like a bright, dangerous bird while Camilla and I drafted the first letters. Bankruptcy, eviction, criminal charges. The law gave me options that would have left them broken. But when I imagined Mateo on his knees, when I pictured Diego and Sofia watching their parents lose everything, the bird folded its wings. I realized I wanted something cleaner, something that would teach them to recognize a person rather than destroy the people they loved by mistake. I wanted them to feel the inconvenience of consequence, not the spectacle of ruin. So I wrote terms that read like justice and felt like a lesson. The house would stay where it had always been, but the rules would change. I kept 60%. They would keep 40%. The split was deliberate, large enough that I could no longer be ignored, but not so large that I would be a vengeful tyrant. This was not about money for me. It was about reclaiming the dignity my name had bought and forcing a reckoning that would not be satisfied by a headline. They had to become landlords, not in theory, but in practice. I chose the tenants. Ana Campos arrived with a small suitcase, 2 school-aged teenagers trailing close behind, and a kettle that smelled like cumin and hope. Anna's eyes were a quiet gratefulness I hadn't realized I needed to see. She hugged me, like someone who understood what it was to lose more than a roof. Her boys, always barefoot, always hungry to tell a joke, learned the stairs, found their favorite window, and taught me the names of neighborhoods I'd never visited. The house, which had been an echo chamber of cold silences, began to fill with the sounds of plates being washed, laughter that wasn't sarcastic, and the smell of onions frying in a pan that belonged to people who were glad to be there. Valeria and Mateo hated it in ways I had imagined. They hated learning how to fix a leaky tap. They hated answering emails from a tenant who asked why the heating was only working on the second floor. They hated the awkwardness of collecting rent from people they saw as charity cases when, in truth, Anna paid on time and treated the place like her own home. Small humiliations, practical lessons. When a pipe burst in winter and Valeria had to cancel a dinner with her mother because she needed to let the plumber in, the lesson was not malicious. It was simply life, shared responsibilities, shared inconveniences. For the first time, they experienced the texture of ordinary responsibility. I watched this with a complex heart. There was a cruelty to the arrangement, there was also mercy. Anna's presence softened the house. She braided my hair without asking permission one afternoon and left little notes on the fridge. Her laughter threaded through conversations and forced Valeria to come face to face with a warmth she had never offered me. There were nights I sat on the porch and listened, the sound of Anna teaching her boys homework, the clack of knitting needles, Mateo's voice carrying apologies into the dark. Those apologies were raw and clumsy at first, like a dog trying to imitate a human. They were not comfort, they were a start. Therapy became non-negotiable. The court approved sessions for Mateo and for family mediation, and I insisted they be weekly and documented. The first session was a portrait of awkwardness. Mateo arrived early, palms sweating, tie askew. He sat across from a quiet woman with a clipboard who asked him to talk about the first time he remembered seeing his mother as a person rather than a service. He stumbled through the answer and then, in a low voice that broke like a thin ice sheet, said, "Mom, I didn't see you." It was not an apology that fixed anything, but it changed the air in the room. I sat in the waiting area and listened, the cheap coffee in my hand gone cold. I had no interest in theatrical forgiveness. I wanted to see him learn how to do the small, necessary things, to name his errors, to hold them, to accept the discomfort of being corrected. Valeria's first therapy appointment was harder to watch. She arrived with the high-heeled confidence of someone used to controlling the narrative. The chair resisted her, then accepted her. She spoke with a measured voice about stress at work, about being judged, about feeling inadequate. The therapist, a blunt, careful woman, asked directly about the phone calls I had saved and the text messages captured in screenshots. Valeria's face tightened. She started, then unraveled. I had no desire to gloat. I had recorded her cruelty to protect myself, to prove that what I had experienced was not imagined. Using those recordings in therapy to expose the patterns she refused to see was not an act of revenge, it was a mirror. Small shifts began. Valeria stopped demanding that I fix everything on a Sunday afternoon. She started to ask when something needed doing rather than assuming. She attended parenting workshops because Diego complained about being shuffled between homes, and she learned, slowly and awkwardly, to let Anna's boys play with her children without eye-rolling or competition. Still, change does not arrive as a neat bow. It arrives in stumbles and relapses. Once, in a kitchen argument over a broken cabinet hinge, she snapped something cruel about free labor before catching herself. The words were poison, then a sudden grimace. I recorded them anyway, I would not unhear it, but somewhere beneath the sting I felt the rope of connection begin to knot again. There were rituals that reshaped the home. Every Sunday morning I would make a pot of tea and Anna would bring over a plate of something simmered, empanadas, spiced rice. We'd sit at the old kitchen table while Valeria and Mateo sorted bills. They learned to schedule repairs. They learned to put tenants' needs on the same page as their own. I watched Mateo, once passive, now reading an email from a landlord association, learning about tenant rights, learning that empathy could be administrative. It was strange to see him with that kind of concentration. It was stranger to feel that I had invited this into being. I felt like a gardener who had planted a bed of thorns and then watered a few roses among them. There were moments of tenderness that surprised me. Diego once brought me a drawing of our house with 3 chimneys and wrote Nana's house in crooked letters. Sophia apologized for a birthday party where I hadn't been included and then later asked if I could teach her to knit. These moments were not compensation for years of neglect. They were seeds. Anna's boys fell asleep on my arm one evening, watching a black and white movie, and something inside me shifted from grievance to the quiet satisfaction of being needed for a simple human reason. Valeria tried. She read books suggested by the therapist, titles about boundaries, about intergenerational trauma. She texted short messages, "Working on things, I'm sorry." Apologies came in fragments, unpolished and earnest. Once she left a note on the fridge. Bought extra milk for Anna's boys. It was small, but it was visible. I allowed myself to notice these things. I did not pretend the wounds were healed. I allowed their scab to be touched gently and sometimes clumsily. There were complications. The tenants had their own needs. Anna's oldest son required tutoring for math. Repairs cost more than any of us expected. There was a night the pipes froze and I walked the house in my slippers with a flashlight, listening to the groans of wood and steel. We argued about who would call the plumber and who would call the insurance. These were not battles of power, they were negotiations of a life rebuilt by shared responsibility. When Anna cried once in my kitchen, overwhelmed by the balancing act of work and childcare, I made her sit and drink tea until her hands stopped shaking. The gratitude in her eyes felt like payment for something I had given myself, the right to be treated like an equal. I kept the ledger on my bedside table for a while, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what had brought me here. $136,800 spelled out in careful numbers was an ugly piece of art that would not go away. The deed to 847 Jurist Circuit was a physical proof that I had not been invisible in all ways. It was an anchor. But I did not let the ledger become my voice. I let it be the quiet, factual note beneath the louder human conversations that started happening in the rooms of my life. Months passed. The household became a choreography of new roles, rent collection days, communal dinners on Thursdays, and a rota for garden work that Valeria initially scoffed at but later accepted because the tomatoes needed picking. I watched her hands learn the practicalities of co-ownership. I watched Matteo apologize in small practical ways, fixing a broken shelf, taking responsibility for a utility bill he had ignored. Their discomfort was not theatrical, it was honest and, in its honesty, slowly effective. And then, at a quiet late afternoon when the light fell through the living room curtains like a promise, Valeria came to me with a paper folded in her hand. Her voice trembled slightly, not the theatrical tremor of manipulation, but the rawness of someone who had rehearsed courage all night. She said she wanted to earn things, not take them. She slid a formal loan offer across our old kitchen table, the ink not yet dry. The offer was imperfect and insistent and vulnerable. It was, finally, an attempt to meet me on terms other than entitlement. I looked at the paper. The edges were nervous. Her eyes were honest in a way that the expensive dresses and strict smiles had never been. My thoughts were not simple. I felt the scales of justice balance in my chest. The ledger, the deed, the recordings, they had been tools and weapons. This paper, offered now, felt like an offering of a different kind. It did not erase the past. It promised work. It asked for trust. I let the silence grow long enough that she could hear it echo. The house hummed around us with the sounds of Anna's children distant in the hallway, Matteo on the phone arranging a repair, and the kettle beginning to sing in the kitchen. I folded the paper slowly, the motion careful and deliberate, and remembered why I had chosen this path in the first place. Not to destroy them, but to teach them to see me. I signed the papers on a bright morning that smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh coffee. The sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds in neat bars and warmed the table where Camilla had spread the documents like a map. I balanced the pen between two nervous fingers and thought of Luis's laugh, of the way he always insisted on signing his name with a flourish. This time, my signature felt different. Not a surrender, but a seal. Matteo sat across from me, eyes rimmed with something like shame and something like hope. Valeria stood at the doorway, hands folded, face soft with an apology that took practice. The check she handed over was precise and earnest. It was the sound of someone choosing to earn rather than take. I accepted it because I wanted a life rebuilt, not revenge that would eat me whole. Signing felt practical and ceremonial all at once. The contract was neat. The ink was final. We each had our copies. The morning light caught the corner of the deed and made a small lighthouse on the table. I told them then, not loud, just steady, what I expected going forward: honesty, boundaries, and a willingness to sit in discomfort long enough to learn from it. They listened. They agreed. I felt something like release, but mostly I felt steady ground under my feet for the first time in years. Months passed, and the days grew warmer. The house smelled different now, not only of antiseptic or cooking that served nobody's pleasure, but of yarn and rosemary and good, plain conversation. I started teaching knitting again at the community center down the road. The first class I ran, my fingers remembered everything. Yarn slid between them like old friends finding each other. The room was tiny, all mismatched chairs and sunlight, and by the second week the chatter folded into the rhythm of needles clicking. Women I'd never met before told me their stories while we worked a row together. Losses, small violences, tiny humiliations that stacked up. They called me steady. They called me brave. That felt like a new title I could carry. The grandchildren came to visit, but this time it was on my terms. Diego still had that lopsided grin. Sophia's hair had grown into 2 braids she was pleased with. They arrived with noisy energy and a backpack full of pictures they'd drawn. Not the embarrassed, photographed kind of attention I used to endure, but something warmer. We made jam that stained our fingers red. We read stories where the old woman was the cleverest character, and I taught Sophia how to purl without sighing. Mateo dropped by more often, but he stayed at the back of the kitchen, doing the small things he'd promised: fixing a leaky tap, taking out the rubbish without being asked, staying for tea, and listening. Action stacked up into trust, not all at once, but enough to build a bridge. Living through the aftermath was not a straight line. There were rough days when the memory of being erased slipped back in like a cold draft. My pockets would rattle with old receipts, and I'd find myself scanning them like a lost language. On those days, I pulled out the ledger, the one that held cold, meticulous numbers, and reminded myself how those numbers told a truth I had every right to protect. But alongside the ledger, there were other proofs. The laughter around my kitchen table, the way Anna's children called me Auntie Clara, and meant it. The sound of Mateo laughing properly and not just apologetically. Anna moved into the house on the second week after co-ownership was settled. She arrived with 2 duffel bags and a warm, cautious smile. Her cooking changed the air immediately. Cumin and garlic, bread baked with a crust that made you want to stand there holding it while it cooled. Her kids filled spaces that had been silent for too long. Their shoes lined up by the door like bright little exclamation marks. She called me sometimes by my name and sometimes by a nickname that made my heart tug in the right way. The house adjusted to include strangers who became friends. And in that reshaping, space opened for learning. Being a landlord was its own kind of lesson for Mateo and Valeria. They learned to schedule repairs and set rules, to talk about rent increases and late payments with people who depended on their decisions. It was embarrassing for them at first, to argue politely about a leaking roof in front of someone whose life was held together by a careful budget. They had to face realities they had once brushed aside. Watching them struggle with spreadsheets and maintenance calls felt like poetic justice, but I kept reminding myself that what I wanted was correction, not cruelty. When a pipe burst and soaked Anna's kitchen, I heard Mateo on the phone that night, frantic and apologetic, and then I heard him say quietly, "We'll fix it. We'll make it right." It was the sound of someone learning the weight of responsibility. Therapy didn't look like a single dramatic breakthrough. It was a long, uneven road. Mateo went first because he needed to carry what he'd ignored into a place where someone could help him unpack it. He sat in a chair and said things like, "I never realized," and "I wanted peace so badly I let things slide." Those were hard sentences to hear, but they were true. His therapist helped him map out ways to show care that didn't require permission. I went to a few sessions with him at his insistence. Sitting in that cool office across from a woman who asked simple questions, I felt both vulnerable and strangely relieved. We did exercises that forced us to speak honestly. Letters read aloud, lists of needs, apologies that named actions. Mateo's apologies became less about words and more about deeds. He started cooking a meal once a week without fanfare. He took the children to the park so I could rest, and he showed up for the small, ordinary things that add up. Valeria's transformation was messy and sincere. There were nights she sat on the edge of the couch and watched the tenants come and go, and I could see a churning of guilt and curiosity behind her eyes. She started reading books about empathy, essays on privilege, and sometimes left a note on the kitchen counter. Thank you for being patient. I didn't rush to accept every overture. Trust is not a switch, but I noticed the small practices. She stopped posting pictures that excluded me. She knocked before entering rooms. She began taking her therapy seriously, the way someone who knows they have work to do would. One afternoon, I watched her carry a bag of groceries up to Anna's apartment because the woman had been on an early shift and the bus had run late. She hesitated at first, then rang the bell and smiled. Anna opened the door, surprised, and Valeria handed over the bag like someone paying a debt. That moment, small, unbroadcast, unglamorous, felt like a seed. Community response surprised me. Messages arrived in a slow, steady river. Private DMs, comments under videos, emails from women who said they had felt invisible for decades and found courage in my choice to leave rather than be diminished. The comments were short and raw. You gave me permission to leave. My mom deserves better too. Thank you for showing dignity isn't loud, it's consistent. A woman who taught at the high school down the road wrote to say she brought my story to her class and used it to teach a unit on boundaries and respect. These notes were anonymized, of course, voices without faces but with weight. They arrived not as fuel for vanity but as proof that one person's reassertion of self could ripple outward. Sometimes, when the night felt long, I'd read a few and let their warmth steady me. There were practical consequences, too. We formalized the tenancy agreements. The tenants paid rent on time most months. Sometimes they were late, and we learned how to talk through it without assuming malice. I visited the community center with Anna and asked if she might help me co-teach. She blushed and agreed. My knitting class grew. People brought tea and stories. We celebrated small victories, a repaired staircase, a stable heating bill, a child's acceptance into college. Those mundane triumphs tasted like honey after so many years of being ignored. Forgiveness did not come like a curtain lifting. It was a choice I made daily, sometimes reluctantly. I forgave to unburden myself, not to erase the past. I forgave because holding onto hatred felt like carrying a meal that had gone off. It only made me sick. I also insisted on boundaries. When old patterns resurfaced, a passive-aggressive comment, a forgotten birthday, I addressed them with calm clarity. I won't be spoken to that way, I'd say. Sometimes they listened, sometimes they needed reminding. Each time they remembered, the fabric of our lives grew a little stronger. The most surprising thing about reclaiming my life was the quiet happiness that seeped into ordinary moments. There were afternoons I would sit on the back porch with a steaming mug of tea, the yarn knitting a pattern across my lap, and watch light fall on the garden where I had planted lavender. The scent shaped the air into something patient and steady. Children's laughter drifted from along the fence. Mateo would walk past carrying a bag of groceries, nodding without theatrics. Valeria would wave from the kitchen window, and sometimes we'd meet eyes and share a small private acknowledgement that we were both trying. There were hard reckonings, too. People I had once trusted distanced themselves because they refused to take sides. There were letters, terse and angry, from relatives who thought I had been too harsh. I read them and folded them away. I had no interest in converting those who would not listen, but I did make room for those willing to change. One afternoon, a year after that night of instant soup, I watched Valeria take a tray of warmed food up to Anna's apartment when the tenant fell ill. Valeria hesitated on the landing, then knocked. She entered with cautious footsteps and left with a quiet smile. Anna later told me, embarrassed but sincere, she stayed to talk, she listened to the kids' stories and didn't rush. That small, attentive presence, it was the kind of evidence that matters. It showed that accountability can lead to change when it's met with work and humility. There was a moment months later, when Valeria came to my door with a folded piece of paper. She had written an offer to buy my share and had done so in a way that felt genuine, not hurried. She had asked for time to arrange a fair loan. I accepted because I had always wanted to be free from the burden of watchfulness that comes with losing trust. Accepting did not erase the past. It created a path forward. The tenants remained, the house remained lively, and my life took on a new rhythm of my choosing. On a quiet evening, after the dishes were done and the children were tucked in, I walked into the living room and looked at the shelf where the key to the house rested. It was ordinary, a small thing with the patina of use. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It had belonged to me all along in ways that mattered more than possession. It was a symbol of agency, of decision, of a life that would no longer be erased. I smiled, not triumphantly, but with the soft satisfaction of someone who had learned to protect herself with dignity. The house hummed with life around me, repairs made, floors swept, laughter in a distant room. I placed the key back and felt, at last, the gentle weight of a life reclaimed, fade to near silence. Love without respect becomes a pattern that eats away at the spirit, and I refused to keep living inside a life that required me to shrink to survive. I stepped out of the shadows they kept me in and rewrote every part of my story with boundaries, clarity, and a voice they could no longer ignore. What I reclaimed wasn't just a house or independence. It was my place in the world, the one I should never have surrendered in the first place. If you feel yourself slipping into invisibility, know that change begins the moment you decide your worth is not up for debate. If this journey stirred a spark in you, tap like and subscribe for more true-to-life stories that refuse to stay silent. Share your experience in the comments and let your truth help someone else find their strength tonight.